We are picking up with Digestive System PowerPoint Slides Part 1. Today we're going to talk about the stomach. And if you're following me in your course pack, I'm on page 85 at the bottom of that page. Just want to take you back to Bio 210 for just a moment. You may recall the stomach is found in the epigastric region of the abdominopelvic cavity. It's covered somewhat by the ribs on the left side and by the liver over here on the right side. The stomach is a J-shaped pouch or organ that helps to serve as a storage tank for food as it's ground up further. It does perform both mechanical and chemical digestion. Let's use this picture to talk about the four regions of the stomach. We know that food is traveling in from the esophagus, it passes through a sphincter, and then it first enters a region closest to the esophagus called the cardia or cardiac region. Of course, that's named for its close proximity to the heart. That's why some heart and stomach problems mirror image and mimic each other, making it difficult for someone to know which is actually the root cause. This next region that kind of is an expansion point for the stomach is called the Fundus Region. Let's draw a line there. Between these two lines is what we call the body. We know the greater curvature on the outside curve and the lesser curvature here. The body is home to glands that secrete acid and enzymes that help with digestion. And this region down here is called the pyloric or pylorus region. It also has glands that secrete mucus hormones, things like gastrin. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Let's talk about these sphincters. They're over on page 86. You may recall the gastrointestinal tract. Most organs have four layers. From the inside, we have a mucosa lining, then a submucosa. Coming on out toward the external portion, we then have muscularis externa. So muscularis externa has two layers of muscle, an inner circular muscle layer and an outer longitudinal muscle layer. It is those inner circular muscles that make a squeezing type of sphincter that's found here. We call that one a cardiac sphincter, or you can call it the lower esophageal sphincter, or LES for short. That sphincter is a valve. It regulates the passage of food from the esophagus into the stomach. So it's pressure regulated. When food sits against the sphincter opens. Down here at the other end, we have a pyloric sphincter. That pyloric sphincter again regulates the passage of food from the stomach into the small intestine. Now these sphincters can also work in the opposite direction. Food can travel against them, back out of the digestive tract through vomiting, or if you have a really full stomach, we have to go somewhere with that food, so those sphincters or valves may open in that case as well. The inside lining of the stomach is folds of mucous membrane. This is called rugae. When do you see it? When the stomach is full or when the stomach is empty? Well, you only see it when the stomach is empty. In fact, when full, the stomach stretches and can hold as much as a gallon of food. Next, we're going to talk about the microscopic structures and secretions produced by the stomach. Keep in mind here, when the stomach is digesting food, we can hold as much as a gallon of food. The environment here is very acidic, around a pH of 1 or 2, and we need to protect the stomach from its own secretions. So there is a thick layer of mucus made here to protect the stomach from digesting through this single layer of simple columnar epithelial tissue. Okay, and that's why stomach secretions that back up into the esophagus can erode or eat away at the esophagus lining. We don't have that thick mucus secretion in the esophagus like we do here in the stomach. So I'm going to use this space over here for a moment just to think about what's happening when you are hungry and getting ready to eat. If we are talking about eating, or maybe you smell food, see food, or even are tasting food, then your brain gets you into the gear of parasympathetic mode. You may recall that there is a vagus nerve that travels away from the brain, and that vagus nerve serves a major role in stimulating your stomach. So down here is your stomach, not as big as your brain, hopefully, right? And that stomach is going to receive messages from your vagus nerve, and it's going to be stimulation. Let's get some hormones, some chemicals produced here so that we can start getting ready to digest food. So even me simply suggesting lunch or dinner, or maybe some hot pizza, maybe fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, how does hot chocolate cake with ice cream sound? If any of this sounds good to you, then your brain is getting you into parasympathetic mode, sending stimulations through your vagus nerve, telling your stomach to get ready. So the first set of cells that are going to respond are going to be these enteroendocrine cells. They release a hormone that's called gastrin in response to stimulation from your vagus nerve. You may recall that hormones travel the bloodstream, and of course the stomach is kind of talking to itself, right? Because the vagus nerve tells the enteroendocrine cells to release gastrin. Gastrin travels the blood, comes back to the stomach and targets these parietal cells, which then secrete hydrochloric acid or intrinsic factor. So let's go through that one more time. Talking about food, smelling food, seeing food, or tasting food will cause your brain to stimulate the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve in turn tells your stomach's enteroendocrine cells to release gastrin. Gastrin travels through the bloodstream to cause your parietal cells then to release hydrochloric acid and or intrinsic factor. So first is this enteroendocrine cell, second is what is released by those parietal cells. So let's talk about hydrochloric acid for just a moment. It is going to produce an acidic environment in your stomach with a pH of around 1 or 2. That's going to be necessary for us to convert a chemical called pepsinogen, down here, into an active form called pepsin. Second is intrinsic factor. When it's released, it helps us absorb vitamin B12 a little later on in our small intestine. So we have to couple intrinsic factor with B12 for absorption. All right, so let's hit this from the top. When you see food, smell food, think about it, taste food, your brain stimulates your vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve tells your stomach to release gastrin. That's, of course, those enteroendocrine cells. Gastrin then travels by blood to your parietal cells. That's the next step. Parietal cells release two chemicals, hydrochloric acid, which gives us a very low pH, and intrinsic factor, which helps us absorb vitamin B12. Let's tag back to that hydrochloric acid for just a moment. That hydrochloric acid helps us to convert an inactive chemical called pepsinogen into the active form called pepsin. So let's talk about pepsin for just a moment. Pepsin helps us break down or hydrolyze proteins. So we are now talking about how to chemically break proteins down in the stomach. We do it using pepsin. So what type of pH environment is needed for the activation of pepsin? You need a very low pH, something around a pH of 1 or 2 in the stomach. All right, so on your worksheet is a couple of questions about dead center of the page. Under intrinsic factor, it says, do you remember why vitamin B12 is important? Just a memory jogger here, it helps us make red blood cells. And what type of anemia results when B12 is deficient? I'll put that word up here near the top. That's called pernicious anemia. Also on that same page, if you go down about 2 bullet points, just a reminder that we do have mucous neck cells and surface mucous cells, these two here at the top, and they are necessary to help produce a thick layer of mucus that covers this simple columnar tissue, and that keeps the stomach from digesting itself. So that creates a thick protective lining of mucus in the stomach. Just another view here of all these cells in the stomach: mucous neck cells, chief cells which produce pepsinogen. Do you remember what is needed to convert pepsinogen into its active form called pepsin? You need hydrochloric acid. And where is hydrochloric acid made? Hydrochloric acid is made over here in these parietal cells. Well, go backwards. How do you know to make hydrochloric acid in an intrinsic factor? you've got to have enteroendocrine cells. And what do they produce? They produce gastrin. And how does gastrin talk to those parietal cells? It's a hormone, and that travels through the bloodstream. So that hormone comes around through the blood, tells the stomach's parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. All right, so there are other hormones here. This is just one major hormone that we're going to talk about. There's other hormones like ghrelin, for instance, that helps to stimulate appetite and hunger. So in summary, down there near the very bottom of your page, the vagus nerve stimulates the release of gastrin. That, of course, comes from your enteroendocrine cells. Gastrin will travel through the bloodstream and stimulate parietal cells to make hydrochloric acid. That's your blank on the left. And intrinsic factor is your blank on the right. All right. So I'll give you a moment to write down those blanks. We need gastrin to stimulate the parietal cells. The parietal cells release hydrochloric acid. That's your blank on the left. Intrinsic factor is your blank on the right. Okay, and to complete those blanks, under hydrochloric acid, we create an acidic environment in the stomach that is necessary for the conversion of, here's your blanks, pepsinogen into pepsin, and of course on the right side there's another set of blanks. Intrinsic factor is needed for RBC production, and that is of course to increase the vitamin B12 absorption. Okay, so there's your blank, vitamin B12 absorption. All right, very bottom of your page. We are now going to switch and talk about physiology, so I think I'll end this video and pick up with a second stomach video simply for physiology. That one will cover pages 86 and 87.